I'm Randy Horton, Chief Solutions Officer of Orthogonal. I want to thank you all for coming out to our webinar today, Harnessing the Value of Data and Digital in 2025, Pragmatic Strategies for MedTech Manufacturers. So as many of you know, Orthogonal organizes these monthly webinars. I think we've just decided to start calling it a series, actually, because we feel like welcome to the episode of this webinar. What we try to do is bring together experts from medical device manufacturers and other companies to really share best practices about how we're all working to accelerate the development of software-based medical devices. That's the key theme for all of it. To that end of acceleration, we're going to try and pack as much good content as we can in for you. I'd like you to leave feeling like you got at least 2 or 3 hours of content in the 45 minutes to 90 minutes you're here. We will talk maybe till for 45 or 50 minutes in this conversation. We will be taking questions throughout, so keep them coming. But if there's still questions coming after that time, we're happy to continue talking for a while longer. Couple quick things. We truly value your brutally candid feedback about what you did like and what you'd like to see different from this webinar, would have liked to see different, and what your ideas are for future ones. It's the only way we get better. It's the best way we get better, I should say. And second, I don't usually say this much, but people tell us it's weird that we throw a webinar and don't tell you who we are. So Venk will explain during the webinar who they are and why you should always make sure to have a nanoware device on you at all times. But Orthogonal, we are in the business of improving patient outcomes faster. The way we do it is by helping companies building regulated medical device software accelerate their development of software as a medical device, connected device systems, and digital therapeutics. Another way to put that is we work on all the software that's part of a medical device unless it's inside physically inside a medical device. So we do connected apps, web solutions, cloud backends, AI, Bluetooth to physical devices, but we do not do firmware and embedded that are inside a proprietary medical device. And the way we help companies accelerate their development is by taking the best of modern software engineering and product management tools and techniques, not from our industry, things that really came out of the Bay Area and other parts of the tech world that let software eat the world so quickly, as the Mark Andreessen blog said back in 2013, and fuse that with MedTech's need for safety and effectiveness as actuated through laws and regulations, quality programs, and then compliance. In a way that goes far beyond saying we're lean and agile and user-centered, but don't worry, we're still compliant. We basically believe that by really the journey we've been on now for over 15 years of trying to bring these things together in a really sophisticated way, we can not only build medical devices faster than before and build better devices before, but we can actually fundamentally raise the bar on safety and effectiveness of devices along the way. So all of that said, let me introduce our panelists. Bernard, why don't we start with you? Introduce yourself for a minute here, and then we'll flip over to Ben.
Yep, I am Bernhard Kappa. I'm the founder and CEO of Orthogonal, have been in the software business for over 30 years and in medical devices for not quite 15 years. Coming from outside of the medical device world, getting into medical devices, there was definitely a big difference in culture and in how things were tackled within medical devices and how software was treated. And so my journey and our company's journey has been really understanding what really is needed in medical devices on the one hand, and then how can we apply these other best practices, some of which have evolved since we started working to actually optimize for within the medical device space. This particular topic is one that we've run across a lot with our customers, right? We work with medical device startups, but also with mid-size and larger firms. And if they are a medical device company, they are very much used to physical product, hardware, and thinking about the world in that way, and not necessarily software. And if we look at how things have happened outside the the medical device industry, software has taken over the world, and there are a bunch of lessons there that I think both startups and larger companies need to take into consideration. Otherwise, they're not going to be successful as software eats more of the medical device world. So we've worked with Venk for quite some time. I think you're one of our early customers. And with Nanoware, and has since gone and done on and done lots of wonderful things. We I think we're talking to Venk at the MedTech conference in Toronto, and Venk mentioned that for a lot of the CEOs for medical device companies, digital is our future. We have to go more digital, etc. Was a big, like digital is number one, two, three, four, in terms of where they need to go. And that sparked a further conversation, which led to this webinar and probably future webinars as well. So, Venk, let me turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Bernhard and Randy and the Orthogonal team, and to everyone that's joining today. Looking forward to a great discussion. I'm Venk Vardhan, co-founder and CEO of Nanoware. If you're unfamiliar with us, we are a small startup, under 30 people, healthcare at home digital diagnostics platform, providing self-administered cardiometabolic assessments at home. So we do have a proprietary multi-factor, multi-diagnostic wearable that's built on a unique sensor that we invented. So it's a cloth nanotechnology sensor, or a textile-based sensor. And it is the first cloth or textile in the world, first and only in the world, that has been approved by FDA for capture and transmission of essential performance biomarkers off the skin. So we capture electrical signals, acoustic signals, hemodynamic signals, actigraphy signals, and we third-party metabolic signals like CGM and other third-party signals that our multifactorial device doesn't do. So think of our sort of wearable sash doing a 45-minute cardiopulmonary assessment. So rhythm of your heart, acoustics of your heart, blood pressure of your heart, flow dynamics of your heart and lungs and hemodynamic system, respiration, lung volume, activity, movement, and posture. And then when we add in CGM, time synchronously across those 45 minutes to an hour of passive recording, we can get a lot of different data associations between those very related biomarkers that are continuous, but until now we've really looked at in an isolated basis. We look at someone's rhythm in an isolation. We look at someone's blood pressure in an isolation. We look at someone's CGM or continuous glucose in an isolation. We look at their right heart pressures or hemodynamics in an isolation. And that's not really the way that the human body is constructed. All of you on the webinar, Randy, Bernhard, Venk, all of those systems in our individualized bodies work differently with each other. They talk differently to each other, the heart, lung, central vascular, and hemodynamic system. So part of what our topic of today is very exciting for us personally, is that understanding that data journey early on has really helped us differentiate what we can do with our own data pipes. Most, if not all, medical technologies or medical devices spit off data. As we all know, moving into 2025, that is not as valuable in just provisioning data. It has to be sort of structured, and what insight am I actually learning from? So happy to get into that around regulation, your team prep, everything that Bernhard and Randy have prepared. And as to close out, as Bernhard mentioned, we got started on our software journey with Orthogonal back in the day because we were a team mostly of hardware and firmware engineers, embedded systems, embedded software. So connecting everything into the cloud was something we had to learn. But as Bernhard will tell you, and as he advises most of his clients, while of course they look for long-term and sticky, long-term developments, he'd be the first to tell you that this is something you have to take over on your own. And at some point, really needs to come down to the hardware level of because your hardware people are going to understand your data better than any incoming software person will. So I know we'll talk about some of those topics, but it was great to work with Orthogonal many years ago, and we consider them still a partner today. And happy to be here with all of you on the webinar.
Great. Thanks, Venk. And I'll just say a couple words. We're thrilled to have you. And we decided we wanted to do this webinar on the topic of pragmatic strategies for digital and data today. What can you do in 2025 at your company to transform things in MedTech? You were an obvious person. You're a founder, owner, operator who I think has been both visionary and pragmatic. You've been hauling through a very long road and plowing through and making progress, slow and steady, MedTech style, and had some great stuff recently. I don't know, maybe you'll be able to share some of it. But also, you've built by engaging with the industry, you've built some really deep relationships in the industry. And my sense is people just like open up to you, including a lot of CEOs, and tell you what's on their mind. So while you may not, I'm sure you will not name anybody specifically, you'll be able to share a lot of insights from sort of sidebar conversations at hotel bars, and then put your own insights on top of them to really to give us some great perspectives. I think they go far beyond just nanoware, but almost sort of a pulse on MedTech right now. And I was trying to think of the best metaphor to introduce you, and I just found it and pulled it up for 1 second. But I would describe you as the MedTech equivalent of this. You're the most interesting man in MedTech. So,
Thank you.
with all of that said, yeah, anytime. With all that said, the PC came out in the 80s. People started using the internet in the 90s, smartphones in the 2000s, AI ML in 2010s, generative AI in this decade. Software and data are changing the world. How far are we along in MedTech? Are we 90% of the way there to figuring out how to exploit these things? Are we 10%? And what should we be doing differently right now?
I would say we're 100% there on awareness and the need. From an infrastructure standpoint, which is part of the limitations, we are, I'd say, in early innings. And that's an important point to bring up. So I'd say the companies themselves are probably somewhere in between in getting the right sort of expertise and most importantly, vision alignment. Shifting your prioritization to digital is not something you can do overnight. It's very, very thought of as the easy part of our tech, writing code as opposed to building something physical that can be safely inserted into the body and get through FDA and all of that. I am not belittling the hardware genius of all of our companies. It all starts with that. But I also won't belittle the software need of that. And so teams are, and large companies and small companies are 100% aware of their needs on the digital side and are building it. But I mentioned infrastructure, and you brought up a lot of different things from the 80s, 90s, 2000s. That is something that is not necessarily in our control as startup operators and even mid-caps and large-cap operators. And when I say infrastructure, if you think of where the smartphone has come now to 5G and what we can do, that's all because of external infrastructure, right? Whether that's the 5G towers, the fiber optic cables, all of that stuff that has continued to advance from a year to year or by, every 2 to 5 years. Those technologies obviously exist in and around the healthcare system. But from an infrastructure standpoint, when we think of data interoperability, data access, even when we think about what AI can do down the road, from an infrastructure standpoint, we don't have the right sort of standards, the right policies. We have very siloed infrastructure. Some are on old analog systems that would never talk to each other if you could standardize a digital platform on top of them. And so, we are obviously getting into, in that discussion, closed source versus open source architecture, which is In our industry, I would say 99% of everything is closed source, if not 100%. So that's probably part of it. But from an infrastructure standpoint, when we think of EHRs, when we think of closed source infrastructure, when we think of old school analog infrastructure that many of our systems are still working off of, or our customers are still working off of, I would say as an industry, Randy, we are pretty far behind there. And so a lot of that is going to have to be changed from an industry advocacy standpoint and a government sort of policy and standard shifts, which I know we're all actively involved in, and probably all of you on the webinar, your companies are actively involved in as well. But certainly we encourage more activity because if there's more voices, we will get some of this very needed infrastructure progress done that will aid all of us in shaping the next 5 years of our digital future.
Yeah, I would say it's probably the I agree with you, Venk. The awareness is at a high level there, but sort of the details of what that means is and how to get there is really unevenly distributed within the industry, right? I think there are, and even if we look at the different segments, some areas have been on a digital journey much longer than others, right? So, for example, if we look at the diabetes space, right, they've been on a digital integrated leveraging smartphones, clouds, integrating devices, patient interaction, all of that for a long time. And while may not be perfect, they've gone through a whole bunch of things that other people in other areas, say orthopedics, aren't in the same place at, right? But everyone goes through that journey. I find with startups, some of the startups are kind of, they know already that, yeah, we may be hardware centric. This is where we started, but we know we need to build out the digital side of it, and they have the opportunity to kind of do that from the ground up, or partner with folks to do that from the ground up, and then build that in as core capabilities. What I find with a lot of mid-size and larger companies that we work with, um, the it may be what the CEO is talking about and what is being sort of externally communicated, but if you look at how that works on the ground, and the um how how things are organized, and even the thinking of the people on the ground, it's very often not there. That vision, or just thinking through it, is not there, and getting that through is, as you said, it's not hire some software people. It's getting the thinking through into the entire organization.
Yeah, I think that's, we can give examples of what we went through at Nanoware several years before the pandemic. Let's talk 2016 through 18, when we first got our textile approved in late 2016, and then started working on the multi-parametric diagnostic device with our cloth sensors, and getting an FDA approval with that. At the time, I probably, as the founder and CEO, didn't know much more other than the fact that we were getting super clean data from our sensors compared to all other on-body sensors, and a lot of it. And I knew that that would be our gold or oil one day. But that's probably as far as I thought about it, Bernhard. I did sort of talk to the team, and we were probably still 8 people at the time, about us having a forward vision on what we were going to do with this data. And I think part of the, excuse me, the ecosystem of startups kind of helped us in that regard. So we were part of several different accelerators, MedTech Innovator being one, which was starting to bring in some more digital health companies into the fold. But also a big one for us was being in the Google AI Launchpad Accelerator. We were one of 7 MedTech companies that they invited to their inaugural class. And not because we had raised a ton of money or had great Silicon Valley AI investors behind us. It was really on the structure and the nuance of our data channels and our data pipes. And we sent out our hardware engineers to be a part of that 6-month program. We did not have a software team at the time. So Prashant, our current CTO, and Mauli Ramasamy, our head of product and IP, basically learned what AI infrastructure is what infrastructure is needed for AI. And this is when probably most people didn't really understand that, but the folks that are our friends at Google certainly did. And I would say that our team really came away from that with more thoughts from the high level vision, starting to get more to the ground floor. And that's important because when we talk about regulation and FDA, digital and particularly AI is something that is very new to them as well. And they need to kind of learn from us in our interactions when we're going for approvals, as much as they will sort of learn and adapt on their own. That's another issue with infrastructure in our space, is that the regulatory environment is also not capable of keeping up to the pace of innovation in code and AI. And I'm not blaming them for that. They should take a modest approach. But I would say early on, it helped that we were getting education from outside sources that are much more experienced in this space, but really honing it in on what was unique to us. Google could teach us things about infrastructure needed for AI, but they couldn't teach us the structure of our own data. That has to come from our hardware engineers. So long-winded answer to your question or your statement, Bernhard, when we start in early on from a startup and even mid caps and large caps, it's easy to kind of understand I'm spitting out so much great data from this that has not been harnessed and has not been structured. I know that that will be valuable if I do that. That's not just the last mile. There is a good amount of education that has to actually start from your hardware and firmware teams. And you can't just say, I'm going to hire Orthogonal or I'm going to hire some 50-person DevOps group and they'll figure out what to do with my data. I saw a lot of that pre-COVID and into 2021, 2022. There were so many companies that were digital health companies that would come to hardware, quote unquote, hardware companies like us and say, we can be your partner, plug into our portal, we'll deliver this, we'll get the customers. And I understand why those were so well funded, right? Because hardware is tough to fund. It takes a long time. Regulatory processes are a bear. And VCs found that it was just much better on an ROI standpoint to invest in software companies. But the problem with that is that connection time, while it sounded good, actually took a much longer time than people understood. So there were companies that were like, I can plug in all these devices, and now all they've kind of come out with are like e-consent forms, right? Because they never built the infrastructure from the ground up. They were trying to come from the top down. And that generally, when you're doing the hardware, software, and eventually AI handoff, you're going to run into big problems with that. So I think a lot of those siloed software companies are actually struggling to find their business, and more companies are understanding that I need to own this on my own, whether I'm building it from the ground up or I'm acquiring those capabilities. Bringing in a licensing partner, I think, has proven to be a little bit challenging.
Yeah.
So let me throw something out. 1 second, Bernhard, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So putting together your last couple comments between the two of you. Bernhard, a lot of what you spoke about was really companies getting out of their own mindset and learning how to kind of break, from 2D to 3D world kind of thing and think differently, which is not an easy thing because you're good at what you do and you know what you're doing. That's made you successful. Venk, you've talked about you can't just hire a software partner, plug it in, and be good to go. You have to have this sort of metamorphosis process. Um, and somebody else isn't going to just come in and tell you what it is. You have to know your data. On the other hand, what was interesting that you said was the thing that really took us through was when we got out of our office and spent time embedded with Google, having them walk us through their process, that was a transformative moment. So I was hoping the two of you could talk about that, and Bernhard, whatever you were going to say before. So
Yeah, I mean, maybe if we step back, Venk, I'm sure you have your mental model around this, but my mental model is, in in the modern world, what does going digital really mean, right? We've got all kinds of our business processes as a company, our customers' business processes, patients' processes, all of these types of things that are getting uh more and more mediated by software, right? um Sensors, systems, all of these things are things that are potentially spitting out data, right? um and ultimately, going digital means capturing that data, harnessing that data to improve those processes, to automate things, to get decisions in. And that is, if we look at that, is what has happened outside of the medical device space. And it is something that if we do that inside the medical device space, the things we can do are, certainly uh, any of the services and processes that are around our medical devices can be made more efficient, whether that's customer service or, frankly, patient engagement, adherence, or actually usage of devices. Um, Diagnostics, et cetera. All of these types of processes um, and your product development process are all things that can be improved. That's how it works outside of the device space. And so that is kind of how you have to think about it. You also have to think of, so that means data itself is potentially extremely valuable. It is not exhaust that should be, disposed of. It is what can potentially multiply the value of your company and your services over the long haul and make you, both the bottom line and the top line really, really improve. So that's the core, like, first step I would say is really think about that data that you use to run your business, that you get out of your process, out of your devices, et cetera, and treat it like gold.
Yeah, totally. I would say from again, we've been at this almost 10 years now and just recently commercialized in 2024 on a B2B business side. Obviously, every channel of data that we do from a full cardiometabolic assessment, you can't combine all of those into appropriate existing reimbursement that was built for these little pockets of diagnostic and monitoring assessments. You'd have to cobble together a bunch of reimbursements. So we actually sell B2B into the clinical research space to start. And because these are minimum 3 to 5 year studies, and the fact that we have our third 510K or third FDA approval had nothing to do with our device. It's our end-to-end mobile back-end ingestion pipeline and then front-end delivery system. We can give our hardware away for free if and when it's needed on a per trial basis for safety and efficacy endpoints at home. But what we found is that the CROs and even some advancement on other organizations like DTC platforms, which are really touching the consumer in a new way around healthcare, consumer-based healthcare, will white label our software platform to them and charge platform access because they need that ability to get multiple sources of data into a particular channel and be provisioned that sort of data in a structured manner that is dependent on their customers' protocol. So if Pfizer comes to a CRO with an oncology protocol, and again, we're very early here, so I don't have a bunch of case studies to point at. But if they came with an oncology protocol, okay, oncology isn't necessarily cardiometabolic, so why would they work with Nanoware? Well, every product has an effect on blood pressure, or FDA needs to see if it has an effect on blood pressure. Every product has an effect on glucose tolerance or intolerance, and they need to see what this product is doing on blood sugar. So it may not be your efficacy endpoint you're looking at, but it certainly will always be a safety endpoint. And so whether you use our device, you use our device plus a CGM, you use our device plus a CGM, plus a pulse ox, plus a Holter monitor, or use the Holter monitor and the CGM, and you don't use our device at all, there's value in the infrastructure we have built to deploy that directly on. So if I had asked myself, what does digital mean 6, 7 years ago, Bernhard, I probably would not have said we'd be white labeling our platform. That is a sort of happy accident, I'll fully admit, that we fell into. But ultimately, it resulted from that idea that our data and people's data in combination is gold. If you're just spitting out ECG reports, which is what digital was in the first generation or second generation, that was great at the time. You got an FDA approval for that, and a company like Medtronic or Boston Scientific would acquire you 10, 15 years ago. That bar is now much higher, right? It's not just about spitting out the ECG signal. It's what am I doing with it? So that's when algorithms come in. That's when structured data comes in, and that's where correlative data comes in. And everybody, irrespective if you have all the channels, if you don't need to have 85 biomarkers like we have, principally to know that your proprietary data source is gold or oil. It may not necessarily be gold or oil just by itself, right? So you may need to find partners with other sources of data that are relevant. That doesn't mean ingesting all types of data, because then you're going to get noisy. So I think when you say, as an organizational manager, we need to go digital, what does that mean? It's really doing a lot of homework on understanding where is your unique, fire hose of data from your products. And can that on its own be structured in a manner that is providing great insight to the multiple stakeholders we sell to in healthcare? That's providers, payers, government entities, and then ultimately the patients. And it doesn't need to hit all 4 of those. It could maybe just hone in on 1 or 2 of those. So understanding the end game first, working backwards, and then understanding what other data sources do I need, and or if I don't, how do I structure and package the data that I have? And that should inform you on what you need from a team standpoint, and or what you need to train your existing team on. And so we had success doing that. But again, I think part of this is also getting a little bit fortunate and falling into the right business model. And obviously we're the first to admit that the pandemic, albeit now almost 5 years ago, really pushed the sort of motivation more widespread for home-based solutions, right? And then obviously FDA sort of coming out and saying we need real-world evidence, and real-world evidence comes not in the clinic or in the hospital. It comes when you're at home or at your place of work. And so I think those industry wins that kind of all converge really helped companies like us, and I imagine help a lot of the connected care products that are out there. But I think honing in on your data source, the value to the stakeholder, working backwards, and seeing what other forms of data or data combinations to your data will make that uncut rock into a diamond.
That's the data side of this. If you really think about it, I'm quoting from a different area, from marketing, right? The old saw goes that 50% of your marketing dollars are wasted. You just don't know which 50% is wasted, right? And I would argue in the data side of it, 50% of your data is useless, or some percentage of your data is useless. You just don't necessarily know which part is going to be useful and useless. Um, And the other part of it is very much sometimes the data on its own isn't particularly useful, but when it's combined with other data, it can be extremely powerful. So, uh, given that, my advice is typically capture all the data that you possibly can, as long as it's free or nearly free to capture that data, right? There is some data that is expensive to capture. If the answer is, uh, you know, in order to improve my CGM or my insulin pump algorithms, what I really need to do is run blood tests continuously on people. That's a really, really, really expensive thing, as opposed to just capturing the data that is coming off of my device and my sensors and the mobile apps and how people are using them, etc. That is the cheap and easy stuff that you can get out of digital. For the other things, you probably, it may well be worth it to do something there, but for that, you really need to, almost have a healthcare data or a data economist that can help you, you know, understand those trade-offs, and what the cost versus benefit of capturing some of that data is, and how you're going to use it.
Yeah, totally. And I think as a startup, you can't get too grandiose with your vision, right? Because your investors are expecting you to get product to market and start making money, especially in today's environment, which is not the VC ZERP era that ended in late 2021 into 2022. And I would argue that that's probably, while startups will complain that the funding market is closed, and it certainly is compared to where it was. I would argue that it's providing a better path for startups in not over hiring. And to your point, like, oh, okay, I raised $50 million. I better hire 30 people in marketing because that's what the company next to me did, who just raised $50 million. You're not focusing in on what your core value is, which is your data at that time, right? So I think that this is a good moment for people to understand what their assets are, compared to just growing at all costs. But I'm very, very cognizant of the fact that you can't have too big of a vision on what is needed. Ultimately, for a platform like us, what's going to be the next sources of data that's going to be so valuable to our AI alongside the 9 diagnostic channels we do time synchronously? It's certainly going to be lab and blood tests, and it's going to be genetic history, right? We're not going to be able to pay for that right now, right? But it
Right.
has to be on the
Exactly.
roadmap, as we talked about. If you're not sort of planning for it on a 5-year plan, digital is not a 1-year plan, it's a 5-year thing. And just like any sort of product planning should be. And you've got to get your investors to kind of buy into that plan as well as new investors.
So you make a couple interesting points. One is, it's funny, I had the metaphor of like, you can't eat the elephant all at once. On the other hand, you probably should be a little strategic about where you're going to eat it and where you're going to eat next, and your strategy for eating the whole elephant. So interesting, you talk about, I think, some great examples that are pretty common of how data has enabled sort of new business models. And I'll classify the ones you talked about, sort of data monetization, MedTech as a service, data as a service, those kinds of things, which I think are very much in line with business models we're seeing in lots of industries, right? Of this kind of thing. I wanted to throw out, we've seen, and to your point about finding funding, we've seen some in the marketplace, some real success with some other kinds of business model evolutions that are also data enabled, but in different ways. And I'll throw out two. I don't know. And I haven't mentioned this to you guys before, so this may come as a surprise or part of it. One is warranties. There's now a whole trend, particularly in orthopedics, where you're starting to see warranties of implants. If it doesn't last this long, we'll replace it for free. Sometimes that's the MedTech company. Sometimes there's a famous one of a MedTech company plus a specific provider or giving a lifetime guarantee on the warranty. Presumably, you can't do warranties like that unless you've got a pretty good actuary table and some data to value the risk on that of the failure. The other one that we're seeing that's interesting, and we're seeing from companies that I think are pretty sophisticated in their approach to business, is we're no longer just the manufacturer. We are now actually a provider as well, specifically around our thing, and not necessarily a provider to compete with other providers, like a virtual first clinic competing with your local hospital. It's more like we'll handle this as a device for chronic disease management that's with you 24/7. We'll handle that relationship and partner with your local physician to take that off their hands and let them focus on kind of the office visit kind of thing. Again, very data enabled. So I'm curious if you guys have any reactions on that.
I do. On the latter, I'll comment first. We have seen a lot of what you suggested, that sort of somebody sort of takes that off the plate, and can manage that sort of care life cycle with the provider or the physician or something like that, using your data. That's probably the right way that investors think about it. Stay in your lane and find the person that can partner. I think that's eroding your value. Again, not everybody can think maybe that far ahead or get the funding to do it. But if you're not touching the end customer with your own data in your own way, I think you're just eroding value. And then you ultimately just stay a device and a hardware company. And I'm not saying that you need to do that to achieve the public market software multiples, right? As opposed to hardware multiples, because hardware in general, you're going to have pressure on your gross margins compared to software, right? But I do think that if you are not able to deliver the solution directly to your customer, and if you're a B2C player, that's very hard, right? Because now you're doing customer acquisition on the software side. Marketing comes into a big play. Even B2B2C gets a little bit challenging, but we found a B2B market. And again, I think we're probably pretty fortunate that most of our B2B customers in the CRO space are not tech enabled, right? And so we can provide that. And again, I think it's just kind of finding your pocket of where your value can start. Because, our next phase of commercialization down the road is when we get our own reimbursement, we would do the same into hospitals and the provider network. So I personally don't agree with laying that off to somebody, Randy, but that is just personal experience on where I think we have created value. We don't sell our hardware, right? We sell data services. We sell platform access. And I don't think I could have told you that was the model 5 years ago. On the former part that you mentioned about warranties and things like that, I think those are great examples of how your product data is actually helping your sales and workflow optimization, right? From the data that it's getting. And those are two separate things, right? There's data from your device and your product that is going to be valuable to one of those four, multiple of those four stakeholders: government, payers, providers, or patients. But there's also data from your device that's going to help you generate sales and optimize your internal workflow. And so warranties is a great example, right? You kind of nailed it, that you can't customize a warranty unless you really understand what's going on with your device and how it's talking to you. From a shelf life standpoint, okay, it's in, a 65-year-old compared to a 45-year-old, where tissue is different by and large, in sort of wrapping around that implantable or that knee replacement or whatever. There's a lot of stuff that you will learn with volume. And I recognize that's a catch-22, because that means you have to get out into the market. You have to be selling to start getting that data at high volumes, to start getting that data to optimize. But that's also got to be part of your plan, right? Okay, when I'm out in the field with 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 of my product that I've optimized from a data delivery standpoint, what do I expect to learn from that going forward that will aid in not only development of my Gen 2, Randy, which we all have to think about. If you're Gen 1, the beautiful thing about healthcare is nobody asks you what your Gen 2 looks like if your Gen 1 doesn't work. And that's very different on the consumer side, right? If your Gen 1 doesn't work, nobody will care what your Gen 2 feature sort of improvements are. But the other thing you can find out from data is just adding new sales features or new features to your Gen 1 or your current generation that you can charge more for. Apple does that all the time, right? On the
Yeah.
consumer side. So that's another thing that I think needs to be managed in your vision that will really be more impactful on your business model as opposed to purely on how you're structuring the data from your product.
I would say on that, and this is something we can probably talk in, like I know we're going to be doing a series here. Um, there's the what you want to do in terms of your Gen 2, and if what we see is if more and more of that ends up being software and things outside of the hardware and device in mobile, in cloud, in other things like that. Not all of that has to be medical device software. You can put boundaries on that, and you can potentially introduce and evolve those things much more quickly. And there are a bunch of techniques um, around that. So, and we can talk about those techniques and in another webinar. But the I wanted to go back to the kind of service thing. The Venk, I agree with you. That is not the kind of thing you just want to sort of outsource to someone else. Ultimately, you know, if you think about, let's say, diabetes companies, insulin pumps, CGMs, combinations of those things. Ultimately, what you're doing is providing sort of the tools for people to manage their own disease condition and or actually providing a therapy, right? So you are a therapy provider at that point as a medical device company. It is mediated through an endocrinologist that checks up on them and does those things. They are involved and they are probably the one prescribing that, at least at present, since self-serve if you don't have a diagnosis is only a small part of the market right now. That same thing in terms of thinking through services, whether that is, you know, nerve stimulation therapies, any other types of things where you can think of it in the same way. It's outside of the hospital. It is, you are ultimately probably, if you think of yourself as just selling a device and disposables as opposed to providing a service, you're going to be leaving money on the table. And as soon as you think of
Or
yourself,
someone's going to eat your lunch in a year or
someone
two.
will eat your
Yeah.
lunch, right?
Yeah.
That's right. Because that data is kind of there's a number of things, right? There's stickiness, there is feedback you are getting from your patients that other people, that don't have that direct data relationship with and interaction with the patient and with the clinicians isn't getting. So that data then you can use in so many different ways as you described in terms of improving your product, adding things to your product that maybe isn't device functionality, but also, in some cases, if you have a non-connected device early on and you have, essentially a phone number that people call for customer service, right? As soon as you are connected and you have a mobile app connected to a implanted therapeutic device or something, you have a different channel of interacting with your customers, and there are so many things you can both provide to them to enable more self-service and to make a customer service interaction, if you have access to all that data, much more effective and targeted to get, to really help you improve that patient experience and that therapy as well, right? And
I
so
think that
those are,
last part,
yeah,
Bernhard, is super important because we've talked a lot about the value of the data, but one thing we haven't really spoken a lot about is how you think about the UX and UI to be able to generate that, right? And that is unique And that is something new, I think, to device manufacturers. Before, it was, let's just make sure it's safe and efficacious. That's how we'll create value. That is not wrong, right? You still need to have that part. That's the foundation of medical technology, is how do I make something safe and efficacious? But when we talk about digital, if you're really trying to harness data that product is doing, you have to have a UX and UI hat on kind of in the beginning, and that is new to our industry. So founders and CEOs at the startup level and product managers at the mid and large cap, what they really need to be doing is getting information from their sales. If they're in market, get information from their sales reps or go out onto the road and start doing customer development practices like the software industry has been doing for 20, 30 years, right? They go out before they build anything and they build something called wireframes, right? Which is probably familiar to us, but may not to every medical technology person. Wireframes are just vaporware or just, some image of what this should look like. And then you go out and you sort of give it to my 1,000 cardiologists or my 500 insurance primes or my 500 patients that will be unlocking that data or steering that data from a steering wheel standpoint. And you have to understand what works and what doesn't. What makes this easier to start my recording? What makes it easier to understand if I've done something wrong from a self-administration standpoint, if we're talking about wearables? Those are aspects that need to be done before your build. And that's difficult for a lot of companies because we come up with some great idea, and half the reason that we are successful as founders is that we're a little bit crazy and a little bit insane in the sense that we're like, we have thought about something that nobody else has. So I'm not going to listen to anybody else outside. But from a digital standpoint, that's the practice. You have to listen.
That's
what
right.
you think may be great from a UX UI standpoint because you're so close to your product may not be what the broader market has. And you could build some great feature that you think is great. And if it's not well received, all of that time and development and your regulatory processes potentially may get thrown out the window. So I think a custom developed or a customer development approach, particularly on the UX UI, Bernhard, it was a point that I thought you made that we probably don't talk enough about when we talk about digital.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So when we're always looking at what are best practices outside the device industry and how does that compare, or how do we interpolate, shall we say, between the two. And one of the ones that I think has been, because hardware was it was very hardware centric and things are slow and difficult to change along the way, was this sort of concept of doing big formative human factors studies and not very frequently, and then doing a summative late on in the process. And as soon as you have software, you can change software more quickly and you can do things in smaller increments, right? Um, and so if you look at how that works outside of the medical device industry, we're just talking about user experience, usability. People do things like 3 user Thursdays, where every Thursday they have 3 users, they come in, they go, we have some user experience questions we want to get answered. We know we have a backlog of those things, etc. And if you think about that, there is no reason you can't do that in the medical device space and have much more informal studies around that, and apply that within, for any of the software related things in the medical device space. And then similarly, once you are out in market, so few of the companies we work with think of putting, you know commercial grade product analytics into their software, sort of, Mixpanel, Pendo, all of those types of things that really, you know, let you see exactly how your software is being used, and do things like cohort analysis when you introduce a new feature. How are different cohorts doing that? Whether you can A/B test that often difficult in the medical device space, or you're just doing canary testing, you can actually see what's really happening with your device and the connected software, how people are actually using it, and then use that as feedback. That's what happens outside the device and what we try to bring in. But it's definitely a new thing for so many, for so many medical device companies.
And one thing on that, I know we should probably move on to other topics, Randy. I'm sure there's questions from the audience. But we haven't really talked about hiring yet. And I think that hiring is as much about honing in on your vision, understanding your balance sheet, and getting a little bit lucky. There are certainly people that in my journey, have tried to break up software in the way that I broke up hardware. Right, my firmware, my physical device engineering, my regulatory. Now, again, I sort of tasked our hardware engineers to be experts on all of that. But in a software standpoint, initially we were thinking, okay, we need a, mobile, back end person and then a front end person. We need an iOS and we need an Android, and then we need a back end and middleware infrastructure person, and then we need a front end web and mobile delivery person. So I was initially thinking the team always had to be 5 people, 5 department heads. I was wrong on some of those things. And then a 6 when you talk about data science and AI, right? There's a lot of people, and I'm not belittling the army of software engineers out there, but especially as a startup and even as a mid cap or large cap, you've got to find one sort of transformational full stack person to start with. That when I say full stack, I mean understands everything from the firmware level to the front end delivery. If you start siloing it each on a department basis, you will never get to the ground floor of the source of your data and trying to apply that vision top down. So we were very fortunate to get somebody that I courted for a long time. And before that, we were kind of trying to put people together here and there. But when we hired Zach, who I would say is a 30-year veteran here, he's not only been a product manager and sort of managed 100, 150 people, but he still writes. He still writes his code, right? And he's been a full stack and mostly has spanned the gamut of healthcare and consumer technologies. And I think that experience of bringing both, that ability to bring both of those experiences in has really helped in sort of structuring our product development plan. And that's not necessarily something that I would say every product manager is going to know. A product manager who worked at Google is very different than a product manager who works at Stryker, for example, right? But the full stack engineering is probably more of a common denominator between a device that Google is working on and a device that Stryker is working on. And so I would urge people to spend the time on finding that one great true horse on a full stack engineer standpoint if you haven't already. And if that person is that you have right now is limited, and the other thing I would ask is advise is understand that person's ability to grow quickly, because some are able to do that horizontally and others are not. And if they're not, I would look to upgrade, because you've got to start with that one sort of central horse, especially when you're in early days. And again, that's just speaking from our own experience. So
That's very similar to our own as well in that regard, right? It's sort of like having that, in our case, our CTO and then senior leaders. That's what we're looking for in those people on the technology side. And then as we're hiring people, it's the same thing. You know, you may be at the scale where you are hiring junior engineers, but you want junior engineers that can grow. If like red flag for me is always like I just want to do iOS development. I love iOS development. I don't want to do anything else. I don't want to expand what I'm doing at all. If we're Android or pick anything, I only do back end. I don't do front end. We look for people that want to expand because you're a better you're a better overall engineer the more things you understand. And yes, you can have depth of experience in one area. But all of these technologies, are going to change. What you did 5 years ago is probably not what you're going to do
Totally.
technology wise in 5 years. So
You
that's a
need a
losing
total
proposition.
technophile that's doing everything from a vision standpoint in your own company, but is also playing around with all types of other stuff that's coming out there. Like Zach, for example, he was one of the first buyers of the Vision Pro, right? Not relevant to us, but that's the type of, in a very, very positive and complimentary way, that's the type of egghead he is,
Right.
like he
Right.
wants to see what's around the corner. Of course, he returned it after a month, but that's the type of DNA I think you need when you're building your digital foundation. And I would argue you got to compensate them very well.
I agree.
Those people are not easy to find, and there's a reason that they're worth a lot of money. One engineer is not the same as another engineer on the software side, and so that's another nugget of experiential advice I would give.
Can you find them at www.peoplelikeZach.com?
I just got lucky again. A lot of this is just good fortune and just getting out into the field. But Zach is somebody I've known and grew up with. We've known each other since we were children. He was one of those guys that never went to college, never got a degree, dropped out of high school, and as we say, went straight to the pros, like Kobe and LeBron did. So again, I knew how valuable he was. And when I started the company almost 10 years ago, I was asking, I was like, you got to come on board. You got to come on board. It took me a while to convince him to come on board. Also, I had to have the money to pay him because in my first few years, I couldn't afford him. So, but again, he was pretty familiar with the technology when he came on board because he's been following the company for some time. So again, a lot of this is marathon running as opposed to pure sprinting, which is difficult for us to communicate, particularly to the startup community and even the mid cap and large cap, where everything is sort of benched on a quarter by quarter basis. What advancements are you making? But a lot of this is communicating that vision to your shareholders, whether you're a private company, venture backed, or public company, and say this is part of the 5-year plan, and these are the investments we have to make.
So we're a little past the top of the hour, and I'm going to be respectful of people's time. So we had two questions that came in that I'll bundle together. But first, I do want to say to everybody, thank you for coming. Send us your feedback. We also may reach out to you to solicit feedback. We'd love to hear it. What was good? What could have been better? What sucked? And what you'd like to see in a future webinar. And as always, if you heard anything that you want some help with, give us a call. Or if you need some great monitoring as a service, give Venk a call at NanoWare. All right, so two questions that came in. I'll ask each of you to kind of tackle them together. They're good. I think they're very at the point of pragmatic today. Here's two things. One is you've talked about a lot of great stuff that we should do. Tell me one thing that people do. You're like, oh, just please don't. Like, if you're going to do anything, don't do that because I've seen that time and time again. It doesn't work. A known worst practice, a common one. And the second one is, all right, I'm ready. I want to learn more. What's the thing I should read, listen to, or watch in February to get me into the mindset and help change my mindset and thinking? So Bernhard, you go first.
There's a lot of don'ts. I'm gonna there it's kind of two flip sides of the coin, right? One of them is if you are a hardware company and you have R&D practices and the quality management system, everything designed for that, um, and you're just going to treat software the same way within that, you are slowing yourself way down and being wasting money and being extremely inefficient. On the other hand, if you are just doing software and you don't realize, oh, there are actually sort of regulations and standards and things like that, that if you don't follow, you are going to be in trouble and may have to throw out tons of data and software, etc. That's the other side. So the answer is like there's a sweet spot in the middle where there are, but that is kind of like that SCMD related expertise that is difficult to find as well that helps you marry those things. So, you know, we've seen people too far on one end. That's a problem. Too far on the other end. You got to find your way to the middle and build up or hire the expertise um, that allows you to sort of connect those two things in a rational way.
So Goldilocks. Okay. And one thing to read, listen to, watch that'll help give you some new frameworks to work on this stuff.
Orthogonal blogs and webinars and white papers. I would say,
We certainly have a lot of them.
They are
right?
good content. I would encourage people to read them quickly on that ladder, and then I'll get into the don't from my perspective, Randy. But I think particularly if you're a product person and or a startup founder, and if you're a startup founder, you have to become a product person. Like, don't just think you can bring general management skills into and run an organization. So get in the weeds and continue to learn. So I think being a sponge and always saying I don't know is a skill that's probably underutilized in this space, because everybody needs to appear to be an expert and be confident. But don't be afraid to say I don't know. That's one don't that ties into where I think you can do. But I think where you're going to learn the most is actually being out in the field and being at industry conferences and building relationships with as many organizations and companies that may or may not even be relevant to you. Some of my best relationships with large cap companies are companies that would never acquire us because they don't have a cardiovascular division, right? They're maybe firmly on orthopedics or hospital robotics or something like that. But guess what? They're going through the same digital growth that a cardiovascular company does. So industry associations like AdvaMed, MDIC, things like that, I think are great. Those conferences, those programs, and the network that you build, you'll just continue learning from. I mean, we didn't get smart by just singularly reading orthogonal stuff, which is great, but it's about hearing what other people are going through in the industry. We're all kind of learning this together as this all moves forward. There isn't a single person that has figured this out, whether they're extremely well endowed or not. Look at how much money Google has poured into this space, or Verily has poured into this space. You would assume after billions and billions of dollars, they would have cracked the code on all things digital. They haven't, right? So learning from others in the space is I think probably the most important. And then the don't, I would sort of say, don't try your best not to grow too fast. And I recognize that's a crazy statement. But the companies that, I recognize half of our job is raising as much money as possible, right? But when you raise that amount of money, your immediate new board is, how are you spending that? Your team needs to grow from 20 to 50 people, or 50 to 100, or 100 to 400. I don't think that's the right way to look at growth up front when you are trying to transform into a data company. Not transform, but sort of utilize and harness your data. It's not going to happen by bloat. It's going to happen by taking thoughtful sort of measures and approaches to the people that you bring on board, as well as the sort of yellow brick road that you're bringing those people on to traverse to the Emerald City. So don't rush this, because the strategy tax of unwinding that yellow brick road when you're halfway to Emerald City it's unrecoverable. And we've seen that with Gen 1 and Gen 2 digital health companies that may have raised a lot of money, but never found product market fit, and can't sort of pivot, the Silicon Valley term, or sort of unwind that sort of pathway and that vision to where they, would eventually exit. So that's my don't, is kind of don't rush. You've really got to do the thinking and the education as best as you can up front. And that includes, don't rush on hiring your people. Find that one true horse and start building around him or her.
There's a great meme
I
that we can go ahead.
Oh, I had it just to echo on the 100%, by the way, Venk, on what you said. On the first part, one of the things that I have found very gratifying in this industry is in my networking, right? There are people who are thinking and solving similar problems, or maybe even have a different perspective on thinking on them. And they come with a different set of expertise, but we're all kind of in this together. That's the best part of being in this industry, is connecting with those people and trying to fix and solve these problems, or surface the new problems that we're going to deal with. That building out your network of people and or joining a network of like-minded folks is awesome. That's been,
I'll give you a
over the
perfect
last.
example, Bernhard. I mean, it's we can't announce this big data partnership with a large cap that we have publicly, unfortunately, at the moment, but we hope to in the next month, when their marketing approval and all that goes through. But we've had a weekly standing call on integrating their data into our platform. And I can tell you that I brought up his name a couple times, but Zach, our chief of software, leads the efforts from our end. The amount of discussion that I kind of am just a fly on the wall on these weekly calls between him and this large cap company's dev team is just phenomenal, right? You can literally go through stories like, that's what I ran into 4 months ago, right? On some issue. And you may think it's very specific to the complexity of Nanoware's tech stack or the data partner's tech stack that I'm talking about, or somebody else's. But there's a lot of experience that comes from just sharing and being transparent of what you have run through. And the more important point I think I'm making here is that Zach has now built a very good personal relationship with that dev team. They really respect each other. They would consider themselves work friends to some extent. And you don't understand how valuable that is, right? Because even when this data partnership is done and we'll be working with them ongoing for upgrades and stuff like that, being able to ping these people saying, hey, I'm running into a problem with something else, right? Did you ever come across this, several years ago when you were in your
That's
general
right.
too? That is stuff that's just going to save you so much time because you've got critical mass from experts that are in and around your field. So
So,
Absolutely.
all right. So basically, we'll wrap up with this, the summary of what you said. It's, you want a Goldilocks. Everything's not a hardware development. On the other hand, if you only know software and don't understand the purpose of MedTech, uh, safety and effectiveness and regulation, you're going to be in real trouble. Build a big network and learn from the people in those network and ask a lot of questions. And I would summarize, Venk, your point about too much money too early is actually can be a curse and not a blessing because it can incent the wrong behaviors. I saw a meme recently that said, weeks of coding can save you hours of planning. So with that,
that's a great summary.
I think we will close it out. Thank you to all of our attendees, and we'll see you again next month.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Vank. Appreciate it.
Thanks, gentlemen.